to Genesis chapter number 15, and we got a couple spots that we're going to read, Genesis 15 and Genesis 16. If you notice, the sound's a little louder because we finally got some speakers to help with that. Obviously, you don't need that on my part, but for others, you might need it. Genesis. All right, Genesis. Yeah, you can, can't you? All right, Genesis 15, and going to need some readers, people who can read through the text all the way to the end of the chapter. This is what's called the Abrahamic Covenant. Abrahamic Covenant, one of the most important Old Testament covenants that we see and is still being fulfilled even to this day. Abrahamic Covenant. All right. Let's get 1 through 5, Bill. 6 through 10, David. 11 through 15, I get one more adult, and then we'll split it out with some kids. Darla. And then 16 and 17, we'll have Paul. 18 and 19, TJ. 20 and 21, Shy. Go ahead.
After these things, the word of the Lord came unto Abram and David, saying, Fear not, Abram, I am thy shield, and thy exceeding great reward. Abram said, Lord God, what wilt thou give me, seeing I go childless, and the steward of my house is this Eliezer of Damascus? And Abram said, Behold, to me thou hast given no seed, and lo, one born in my house is mine heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came unto him, saying, It shall not be thine heir, but he that shall come forth out of thine own bowels shall be thine heir. And he brought him forth abroad and said, Look now towards heaven, and tell thy stars, if thou be able to number them. And he said unto them, So shall they see.
Okay.
And he believed in the Lord, and he counted it to him for righteousness. And he said unto him, I am the Lord that brought thee out of Ur of the Chaldees to give thee this land to inherit it. And he said, whereby shall I know that I shall inherit it? And he said unto him, Take me 2 heifer of 3 years old, and a she-goat of 3 years old, and a ram of 3 years old, and a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And he took unto him all these, and divided them in the midst, and laid each piece one against another, but the birds divided he not.
Amorites.
Of the Amorites is not yet full. And it came to pass that when the sun went down, and it was dark, behold, a smoking furnace, and a burning lamp that passed between those pieces in the stick. Wait, am I supposed to?
No, the 18 and 19 will be TJ. Okay. So, if you remember last time, we looked at God's justice and mercy being displayed specifically in the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Justice meaning God dealt with the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah in a big kind of way, where He overthrew them by fire and brimstone. And mercy in the fact that He sought out those who were His own in the midst of it. And even, it appears, some that were not His own, but were associated with Lot, He was willing to save. Did we find 10 righteous people to spare the cities? No. So obviously that was not enough. It shows you a world that was completely, or at least an area that was completely given over to ungodliness. So God does show mercy. So we do learn the fact that God is righteous. Last week we learned that He is just, which means He does what is right in His judgments, and He is a judge. He has to. I mean, He's the one who has to set right and keep right and hold to right, and when people violate the right, He has to punish it. And so that's how we see Him working on the behalf of the people there. And we get upset about that sometimes, or people get upset about that God has to punish sin, but what would we expect if we expect someone who's right? I think we all understand the same thing. We as just people in general know right and wrong, and know that wrong can't go unpunished. You can't just go around and let wrong go and continue to go the way it wants to go. You have to deal with it. You have to punish it, and it has to be stopped. All right, so we're going to jump back as we looked at chapter 15. It's kind of a few chapters back from what we looked at last time. And this is a covenant that God made with Abraham, or Abram as he's called at this point. And if you remember back in chapter number 12, God had already promised to Abram that He's going to make him a great nation. He's going to make him a great nation. He's going to bless him. He's going to bless others through him. And if we remember that finds its fulfillment really in Christ, who is the source of the blessing to all the families of the earth. And God is repeating that promise here in this passage, and He makes a covenant. This is the first time it's not just a promise, but now it's a covenant. And there's a difference a little bit. I mean, obviously God's been making promises up to this point, but there comes a point where God at times makes covenants. And you say, why does God have to make covenants? Not because He's unfaithful to keep His word, but because man needs some kind of assurance at times. And this is what God is doing, and that's what we come to in this passage. So Abram, the account starts off, he's got this vision. It says that he saw a vision of the Lord. And the Lord, how does He identify Himself to Abram? Gives two things about Himself that He says to Abram. Right there in the first verse. Yeah, I am thy shield and thy exceeding great reward. I am the source of all that you need. I am your protector. Remember, He said, I'm going to bless you and I'm going to curse those who curse you. I'm your shield in that sense, that I'm protecting you. And He says, and I'm your great reward. I am the source of your reward. I am your reward that you're seeking. Okay? Now, how does Abram respond when God shows up? Yeah, I don't have a child yet, God. You say you're my reward. Where's my child that you said I was going to get? I mean, that's sort of the attitude He's got. It almost sounds maybe irreverent a little bit, or like you're missing the point, what God's saying, but at the same time, Abram's saying, God, you promised me. And by the way, how long has Abram been here in the land? Look what it says. Well, look how long he's been in the land of Canaan waiting for the promise. It's found right there in verse 3. No, not 3. It's in here, I know. Maybe it's in chapter 16. 16, go over to 16 and look at verse 3. Yeah. He'd been in there for 10 years. Now, I don't know if there's how many years difference, or if there's any years difference between chapter 15 and chapter 16. But he's been there for a while waiting. And yeah, he would be now 85 at this point. If these are kind of consecutive, maybe a year apart, which it appears it might be something close to that. It's still, he's been waiting for years for God to fulfill what he said he would. And by the way, it's not just he's been waiting 10 years. How long has he been waiting? His whole life. Yeah, he's never had a child. And so that's weighing on him. And you know that's got to be weighing on his mind and heart. And that's why he brings it up. God, last time we talked, you said that I'm gonna have a child. And where's this child? And he actually says, but I have somebody in my family. Is this one going to be it? And he mentions Eleazar, who was his servant. Is this the one that's the heir that you promised that's going to be that'll make the great nation? Is that what your promise is? And is that wrong for him to think that way? No, because God hasn't been very specific about how this promise is going to be fulfilled yet. He has given a general principle that he said that you're going to have you're going to be a great nation, and through your nation, or he says you're going to be the father of many nations, and then through your nation, you're going to be a blessing to all the families of the earth. So up to that point, he doesn't have all the details of how that's going to come out. So what does God tell him when he brings up Eleazar as his, maybe this is the one we're looking to? Out of your own bowels. Out of your own bowels. This promise that I am making will come through you. Yes, you haven't seen a child in your lifetime. Yes, that hasn't happened. But there will come a child out of your own bowels. Now, has he been completely specific yet? Has God given all the details up to this point? Has he said this child's going to come through Sarah? No. So that's still left open. We don't know. Out of your own bowels implies out of Abraham, not necessarily Abraham and Sarah, okay? Which we will see in the next chapter. What does God do at this point? Well, actually, look at verse 6. Abram does what? He believed God's promise. And God did what as a result? Counted him as righteous for it. There's a Abram's salvation experience right there. You know, you say, well, Abram's at this point has been following the Lord and been faithful. Well, he's been obeying the Lord's leadership, but like the Lord's been leading him to this point. And he comes to that place where he finally believes that God is going to do what he said he's going to do in a saving way. Why wasn't it up to that point? I don't know, but this is where it says he actually believed in the Lord and God gave him righteousness for it. I mean, we understand that. That's the same way we're saved, right? By grace through faith are you saved. That's exactly what happened here with Abram. He finally came to that place where he embraced the truth in a full way, in a saving way. Obviously, he believed it up to this point before that, but there came a point where he exercised some type of faith that was a saving faith that was different than what had been up to that point. So what's the difference? I don't really know, because he has, up to this point, we've talked about how Abraham has acted very much like Christ, being willing to yield himself to Lot, being willing to not take a reward from Lot. I mean, so there's been obviously some examples that we've seen that he's already demonstrated Christ-likeness. Even one of the things that we go back to Hebrews chapter 11, and we remember that it says it was by faith Abram left his home, going to a land he had never been. He was already living by faith. So how this comes to the place where he finally gets it, it's hard for me to completely embrace the fact, or not completely embrace the fact, completely understand why this is the saving point and other times it wasn't. I don't know. I'll just leave that up, that this is what the text tells us. That this is the point where he came to finally embracing it. And maybe what's happening here is he's finally understanding what this message is all about. That it's not about just a physical nation. It's not just about a physical people. It's about Christ. And he came to an understanding that that's what this is about. And maybe that's probably why it shifts to that point. All right, enough said on that one. Okay, so God's going to make a covenant with him. Actually, let's look at the text here. He says here in the text, the Lord, it says, he says, this shall not be thine heir, verse number 4, but he shall come forth out of thine own bowels, shall be thy heir. And he brought him forth abroad, and he said, look toward heaven, tell the stars. And then verse 6, he believed the Lord, and he said unto him, I am the Lord that brought thee out of Ur of the Chaldees to give thee this land to inherit it. And listen to what Abraham says. Now this is where the covenant comes into place. He says, whereby shall I know that I shall inherit it? Now the verses before that, 2 verses before that, he believes. And now verse 8, he says, how am I going to know that's going to happen? Does that sound like kind of wavering faith a little bit? Wherefore shall I know this is going to happen, that I'm going to inherit this land? But does God rebuke him at this point? No. In fact, he said he invites Abram into a covenant. And he says, all right, Abraham. He says, get some animals. What animals does he mention there? 5 different animals. You got a heifer, a she-goat, a ram, turtle dove, and a young pigeon. Okay, so you got 5 animals that Abram is supposed to go gather. And what does he do with these animals? He didn't dress them in clothes. He cuts them up, right? Chops them up. That's what the idea of him preparing them. Yeah, he cuts the heifer in half, the goat in half, the ram in half, and the birds he kept whole after he had slaughtered them, and he makes this kind of a aisle right down the middle with the animals on each side. You can imagine blood strewn all the way through the middle of that aisle. You say, what in the world kind of savagery is that? This is awful. Well, this is how they made covenants with each other. And this isn't the only place you'll see that mentioned. There's it's a place in the book of Jeremiah. I forget I didn't write the reference down, but it mentions where the people would divide animals with each other over the fact of making covenants. You say, so what's the significance of that? I mean, when we make covenants with people today, it's usually in writing. Someone writes this, one person signs, and then another person signs. That's a contract, usually how we look at it, right? When you go to a bank, you kind of make a covenant in writing and have it all approved and all of that kind of stuff usually by the people that are the authorities and so forth involved in that. In this case, there's no signing on a dotted line. This is a contract between God and Abram, and in this, instead of it being a handshake or signing on a dotted line, how they did this, and if you go through all the Old Testament and into the New Testament, every covenant is connected to the death of an animal or death of animals. The Noahic covenant that we saw. What did Noah do when God made the promise that he'll never flood the earth again? He was sacrificing animals. And when we're going to get to the Mosaic covenant, does anybody know what's going to happen at the Mosaic covenant at Mount Sinai? Is there going to be any animals being sacrificed there? Yes. And then you get to obviously at the Abrahamic covenant. You got a new covenant made. And guess what Jesus said in the New Testament? This is the blood of the New Testament or the new covenant that is shed for many. That he becomes the sacrifice. He becomes what this is all about. There's an establishment of a covenant in blood. And in this case, the idea of cutting the animals in half and making this kind of aisle down the middle is what they would do is they would have the 2 parties to a covenant. One would walk through it, then another one would walk through it. And it was similar in such a way that they were saying that if you don't keep your part of the covenant, what has happened to those animals will be what happens to you. It was severe. It was a severe type of covenant that you will do what you said or this is what will happen to you. That's the way they did it. And God joined in with it. Now, when this contract began to be played out, how does the text tell us what happened? Abram cuts the animals. He has to keep the birds off while he's waiting for God to show up. Darkness, the night comes upon. He falls into a deep sleep. Is he able to walk through the middle of the aisle anymore? But then what happens? Come on, I'm not hearing just mumbling. What is it? We already got that part. What happened? Walk through the middle? A smoking furnace and a lantern passed between the middle. Two things came through, but none of them were Abraham. What are these smoking furnaces and the burning lantern? What is this? They're appearances of God showing up. And God showing up in two different forms, walking through and making, if you will, a symbolic way of saying, I am making the covenant. But the covenant is not made between me and you, Abraham, as though there's a part that you have to keep and a part that I have to keep. Abraham, this isn't dependent upon you at all. It's dependent upon me. This is the second unconditional covenant we have seen God give so far in our study. The first one was the Noahic covenant, right? It had nothing to do with whether man would obey or didn't obey, or whether animals would do right or didn't do right. God made a covenant with all of His creation, and He said, I will not flood the earth again to destroy all flesh. That's His promise. And He said, and I'm even going to put a token to be reminded of that. Every time you see the rain and a cloud comes in the sky and you see that rainbow, it's to remind you that I will keep my word. That I will keep my word. The reason why Abraham was not allowed to be involved in this is because this has nothing to do with Abraham. Is the covenant about land only? How deep is this Abrahamic covenant really going to? What are we talking about? It's about Christ coming and the salvation of men. That's what this covenant really is about. And that has nothing to do with whether man's going to be obedient or not obedient, that God will fulfill His promise. This has everything to do with God keeping His word only based on His obedience, His willingness to do so. I know that sounds strange when you call it obedience, but His willingness to do what He said He would do. He's not relying upon Abraham in any way. Is Abraham going to do things right from this point on? We'll go to the next chapter here in just a minute. You're going to find out Abraham messed up royally. And he's already messed up once before, where he lied about his wife and said, she's my sister. Well, someone says, well, technically she is, half-sister. But he was lying because he didn't want to stand and be courageous, and he didn't believe that God would protect him. Right? When God said, I will. So, this has nothing to do with God, with Abraham keeping his side of the promise. Even though it's called the Abrahamic Covenant, it is really the covenant God made to Abraham. The promise that He made about Himself to Abraham, refusing to let Abraham have any part in it. All right, there is something else that is said that we want to look at before we really get the fullness of the covenant. Look down a little bit further here. After it says that the covenant happens, God says something else in the midst of the covenant promise. Verses 13 through 21, He's talking about something that's going to happen. Kind of foreshadows something we're going to see in the future. He doesn't tell us specifically right there, but for us who know the rest of the story, we know what this is a promise about. Look what He says in verse number 13. He said unto Abraham, know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. What land are we talking about? Egypt. Why is He doing that? Has anybody got an idea why God is allowing that to go on for all this whole time? Because Abraham's people were sinners? He's telling them in advance what's going to happen. Well, we just celebrated the Lord's Supper a couple weeks back. And the Lord's Supper is based off of the Passover. The Passover is based off of their leaving out of this land. Was there something that was symbolic that does happen in the Passover that we still to this day remember? That Christ is our Passover? That was an Old Testament picture. It was a type and shadow of a New Testament reality, that Christ would be the sacrifice, the lamb that would be slain, and His blood would be put over our doorpost, if you will. And when the Lord passes by, He will not judge us because He sees the blood. When I see the blood, when I see the blood, when I see the blood, I will pass over you. It was a picture, at least. So a lot of the things that God allows to happen are pictures and types and shadows of something that will come to pass in the future. But there's something even more said here about why He allows this to go on for the time. Look down at verse number, verse number 16. It says, "But in the fourth generation they shall come hither again, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full." Who's the Amorites? Who's the children of Israel, or who's the Amorites that he's talking about that the children of Israel are going to come and deal with? Yeah, one's in the promised land. He goes on and actually describes them. Look at verse 18. "In the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, Unto thy seed have I given this land from the river of Egypt, unto the great river, the river Euphrates, the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaims, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgasites, the Jebusites." All of those you could kind of link together as the Amorites all together. And I say, well, why did he call them the Canaanites? I don't know. I haven't looked that up. But what is he saying, the reason why he's holding back the children of Israel from taking the land at this very moment? Because Amorites had not filled up their cup of sin. That, whenever they went in and they took the land of Canaan, it was the way God judged the nation, or the nations of Canaan. He went after them for their evil, and the way in which He punished the evil of those nations was by bringing in the children of Israel. The children of Israel were the ones that became God's wrath tool, if you will, His whip, if you will. And you remember what God said when they were to go into that land? He said, don't spare them at all. They've had hundreds of years of opportunity to get right with me, and they have refused all the way through it. Do you think God may have sent some kind of a message or warning to them all through those years? At least a conscience, if not more. And we don't have everything that God has ever done written down in the Bible, right? So there's possibility He even sent prophets or teachers or leaders to come in and warn them of judgment to come. And they ignored it for 400 years. And finally, He says, but when their cup of iniquity is full, then the children of Israel will be delivered out of Egypt to come after them. And they will be my whip, or my chastening tool upon these wicked people for what they have done. Okay? All right. So that's what we have in part of that covenant promise that God is making. Yes, you're going to get the land. Yes, you're going to become a mighty nation. But there's a reason why I'm delaying for this thing to come to pass. And part of it has to do with I'm waiting for their cup to be full. Okay? All right, let's look at the next chapter. And here we're going to look at Abraham's error. This is where we see Abraham being impatient. And again, I told you, he's been here for 10 years. We're going to look at that here in just a second. For 10 years, waiting for God's promise. Though God has made a covenant, he's still impatient with the fact that this has got to happen. And it's not necessarily Abraham that we're going to see that's impatient. Abraham seems to be kind of passive, and it appears more that his wife is the one that's impatient in this text that we're going to look at. Huh? Well, yeah, they're old. That's it. Time is short. All right, let's go ahead and divide it out again. Let's we're going to read all the chapter. We got 16 verses, so let's divide it by fives again. Bill, 1 through 5. Who wants to do 6 through 10? I'll get adults first on the big reads. Fred, 11 through 15, and then I'll get a 16. David, get 11 through 15, and then Paul, you can get 16. Okay? Eleven. Whoever had the 11 through 15. Was that you, David? That's yours.
Okay. And the angel of the Lord said unto her, Behold, thou art with child, and shalt bear a son, and shalt call his name Ishmael, because the Lord hath heard thy affliction. And he will be a wild man. His hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him, all his brethren. And she called the name of the Lord that spake unto her, Thou God seest me. For she said, Have I also here looked after him that seeketh me?
Seeth me.
Therefore the well was called Beer.
Bir Lahairoi. Bir Lahairoi.
Okay. Behold, it is between Kadesh and Bered,
Bered.
and Hagar bare Adam's son, and Adam,
Abram. Abram, not Adam.
okay. And Abram called his son's name, which Hagar bare, Ishmael.
All right, go ahead. Last one, Paul.
And Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bare Ishmael.
Okay, so we asked the question already, how long Abram's been in the land up to this point? How many years? 10 years. So then by estimation, before this chapter ends, how old was he at that point? If he came in at 75, how old is he now? 85. And by guess, even though it doesn't say in the text, how old would Sarah be? She's 10 years behind him. 75. Okay. So how long had Sarah or Sarai been waiting for a child? How long had she been waiting? All her whole life, right? Not just 10 years. She'd been waiting more than 10 years, right? What was Sarah's proposition to Abram to have a child? What did she say? Yeah, her handmaid Hagar says, go in and have basically a husband-wife relationship and get her pregnant, and then I will take that child from my handmaid and call that mine. And that sounds kind of cruel or unusual or just strange. In that culture, they did a lot of strange things. I can't explain all the strange things, but it didn't sound too bad from what our culture does. Our culture does, we don't even worry about marriage at all. Just have children, do whatever we want to do with them. So, but what is her desire? She wants to have a child. She wants to fulfill this promise too. And is this faith? This is I don't trust God right now. She may not say that explicitly, but she's saying it by her actions, isn't she? She's saying it by her actions. And by the way, I know we say it's, I've said it already, that mostly it appears to be Sarah's doubt and Sarah's lack of trust. But what does Abram do? He goes along with it. It says he hearkened to her voice. Sounds like a good plan, babe. And he goes along with the thing. And so he has this kind of a relationship with Hagar. Now, by the way, where do we get Hagar from? What was it? She says, what's her ethnicity? She's Egyptian. Have they been to Egypt before? Sarah and Abram? Yeah, they had already gone. I know we didn't talk about it, but if you were to go back and read some of the chapters before of this text, they were already in Egypt at one point during a drought time, and they went away with great substance, it says, when they left, because of the fact that Pharaoh wanted Sarah to be his wife. And that didn't work out too well, and to kind of appease Abraham and Abraham's God, he got a bunch of stuff. And it's very possible that he got servants. Now, we don't know that. It doesn't say that Hagar got picked up there and that's where she became. But Sarah's got her own personal handmaiden that takes care of her. And there was kind of this agreement that Hagar will be the one that will be the mother, but I will actually be the adopted mother, legally the mother that was birthed through Hagar. And so they're hoping that they can bring this thing about. Now, verse 2, go back and look at verse number 2. Does Sarah acknowledge that God's sovereign over the whole situation? Look what she says. Behold now, the Lord hath restrained me from bearing. What's she saying there? Does she recognize that God's in control of this? Yes, she does. But then she discounts his sovereignty in the next few statements. Let's go ahead and make this thing work out. She recognizes that God is sovereign over the reason why she's not having a child. God has closed her womb, won't let her have a child. But in the same process, she goes right back and she says, let's go ahead and try to make this thing happen anyways. Now, we might sit back and look at that and say, how stupid. Now ask yourself, how many times have you talked high of God and then done something absolutely discrediting to your statement and belief about God? All the time. Where we say we recognize that God is in control and God is doing this, and yet we act all worried. I'll just tell you, that's me. I've done about faith, and this is what the Bible says about our how we're supposed to trust in Him. And then Monday morning, get up, and that's not being exercised very well. But I have to work at straightening it up before I come to Sunday again, right? No, I'm not saying I try to live a hypocrite, but I'm just saying I do the same thing. I battle with my own stupid flesh and my own stupid tendencies to try to make things work my way without trusting in God, even though I say I do. Right? Huh? Yeah. Well, that's just me. Yeah. So let's ask another question. Is this necessarily wrong at this point? It is and it isn't. Was God allowing this means of having children to happen? Obviously, he was allowing it because it happened. Does that mean that this is how it's supposed to have happened? No. And had God given specific directions on it yet? He had given specific some things, but he didn't say through Sarah. This is a later point. In fact, we already talked about it when we were looking last week at Genesis 18, where he said it's through Sarah. Remember, Sarah laughed. Remember that? That was her response, to laugh at God because she didn't think this was going to ever happen through her. Okay? Did Sarai's plan work? It worked. She had a child. Hagar conceived, and Hagar had a child. As we get to the very end of the chapter, we see that. Now, look at the verses here. She says this statement in let me look at, see if I can find what it is at this point. Verse number 5, Sarai says this, "My wrong be upon thee. I have given my maid unto thy bosom. And when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her eyes. The Lord judged between me and thee." I want you to get what she just said. My wrong, that she admitted she did wrong, is upon you. She just said, I come up with this great plan, and it's your fault. She blamed her husband. Now, was her husband guilty? She knew it was wrong. She obviously knew it was wrong what she had just done and allowed. And she's turning it on him. Now, she's mad at Abram because her plan worked. You know what she's sort of in a, can I just read between the lines and maybe reading under this thing a little bit? She's saying, why didn't you tell me no? Why is it that you listened to what I had to say? And you know what he's probably saying under his breath? If I had told you no, you would have thrown a fit. So I said yes. You know how those little squabbles might go on. So she's taking her blame, but she's basically throwing it on Abram. All right. How does Abram respond to this thing? Yes, you have some question?
Is Ishmael the start of the Muslim faith?
Not. Yes and no. It's not just Ishmael. Yes, go ahead. Well, when God is involved. You know what? After Abram does finally get a child through Sarai, Sarah ends up dying a little bit later. He goes and marries another one named Keturah and has more children through her. You got to remember, people were living a long time up to this point. Even at this point, Abram doesn't die at 80. He has a child at 100, and he lives for another 40 years after that. Yep, or 60 years, I think, after that. Yes? Yeah. Eggs? Yeah. Yeah. And again, just remembering, I think the biggest thing to remember is that we're still living in a time where people are living long. A lot longer than they do now. So that's something to remember. We're still very close to Babel, the time where they were still living at 500, 600 years old in that time. Okay, 400 years old. So Sarah, so after this whole thing's done, she blames basically her husband for why this happens. How does Abram respond to her at this point? Yeah, look at verse number 6. It says, but Abram said unto Sarai, behold, thy maid is in thy hand to do to her as it pleaseth thee. Now, what is it basically saying? You take care of it. You take care of the mess. If it's my fault that this is the way it is, you do whatever you think needs to be done, babe. It just kind of leaves it. Now, I don't know if he was saying that in a snotty way, like maybe we might be have a tendency to say, But he is just kind of yielding the whole thing back to Sarah again. Instead of being responsible and trying to resolve what mess they had just created, he just kind of throws it back on her lap and says, you take care of it. Yeah. So basically, he lets her take care of it. And how does Sarai take care of it? Do you think she's just all glad that, oh, I'm going to get to have a little child. It's going to be mine. Is that her attitude toward Hagar? She's mad at Hagar. Why? Because Hagar got pregnant like that. And Sarai, for 70 years, well, almost 70 years, has been trying to get pregnant. And she can't. Well, 75 years, I guess. Trying to get pregnant, and she can't. And Hagar gets... This plan is working out the way she wants, but it's not working out in her heart the way she wants it to. She's mad. Because it's like, it's not fair, it's not my child. You get what I'm saying here? She's not just looking at adopting children. She wants this to be her physical child. And she's mad that her plan actually worked out the way she wanted it to. I don't know. We just we come up with stupid plans, and then God lets you get the results of your stupid plans, and then you're like, why did I want that? So what does Sarai do to Hagar?
Kick her out.
Well, it says she didn't kick her out. Not yet. That will happen later. She's hard to her. She's harsh to her. So much so that Hagar flees. And if you look at the text, it says that she's leaving and she's going down where she is actually found. It says that she was on her way from Hebron. It appears that it says she goes by the fountain on the way to Shur, is how the text says it. And it appears that she is actually heading back to Egypt. She's fleeing Canaan, heading back to Egypt. And what happens while she's out there in the wilderness, heading back to Egypt? An angel of the Lord showed up. Now, when we see angel of the Lord, we can maybe understand it as being an angel, like just one of his messengers sent, in the sense of just a regular created being, like Gabriel or Michael or something of that nature. Or we can understand it to be God. Now, how do you know the difference between the two? Because God often refers to himself as an angel of the Lord. Look at the verse 9. One of the ways you can tell, and this is one of the things that you'll find that the King James does pretty specifically. When you see the word Lord used all in capitals, L-O-R-D, all capital, it's a way of saying this is God's name. It's the name Jehovah or Yahweh, as the Hebrew would be probably said. Yahweh. And so whenever you see the angel of the Lord all in capitals, it's usually an indication this is God who's showing up. Moses is going to have that when he's at the Mount Sinai and he has the burning bush, and it says, and the angel of the Lord was in the bush. And then the verse goes on to say, take your shoes off because you're on holy ground. To remind him that you're not just in the presence of an angel, and he bows down and worships at the bush. Okay, so this is obviously the Lord. And another way you can tell that is because if you look down at verse number 13, even Hagar recognizes this because she gives God a name at this point. She calls him, "Thou God seest me," and I don't remember what it is in the Hebrew, but it's a one word or two words in the Hebrew. It's one of the names of God, but it's the fact that God saw her. She was not a nobody to God. And that's what the name, so she obviously recognizes that when the angel of the Lord shows up, this is God who's coming. And what does the angel of the Lord tell her to do? Go back to Sarah. And then he makes a promise. What does he say? Yeah, I'm going to bless you exceedingly, your seed exceedingly. It's going to be a numbered of multitudes. So here's something that's going to happen. Because this is connected to Abram, this child is not going to just be a little small family. It's going to be a mighty nation that comes out of this child. The Ishmaelites that are going to come out of this family. And in fact, that's what he tells them to name this child. Ishmael. Ishmael. And then, look at verse number 12. He says, and he will be a wild man, and his hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him. Now, what do we learn about Ishmael? He's not going to be a pleasant person. And his people aren't going to be pleasant people. This is where a lot of people will say that this is where the rise of the Islamic culture comes out of. It does some sense, but not all just them. There's a collection of people that come out of that. But there is obviously some connection to that, isn't there? This kind of a wild nature of the people. And what do we see them to be even to this day? Are they trouble to the world? Yeah, they're trouble to everybody. Okay, so we do see that coming out. Did the words of the angel come to pass, verse 15? Yep, she did bear a son, did call him Ishmael, and this was in Abram's 86th year. All right, so let me give a worksheet, and we're going to close with this worksheet. I've got 4 questions that we're going to go on. Someone grab these real quick. Paul, if you want to take them and hand them out real quick. Real quick. Quick, quick, quick. It means get those feet moving. Speedy Gonzalez. So we can finish up. We only got about 5-6 minutes left, so try to finish up with these questions. All right. Thank you. I got what I need. Thanks. Okay. All right. So let's read here. It says, as we consider Abram's actions, no doubt his intent was to bring about the promise God had given him. He wasn't violating a direct command from God as far as we know from the text, and it probably seemed to him that he was acting in a way that would bring about God's promise. So where did he go wrong? Answer the following questions to see if you can understand this idea better. Number 1, what action did Abram previously taken, or what action had Abram previously taken that demonstrated his lack of trust in God's promise of an heir? And this is back earlier, Genesis chapter 12, verse 10 through 13. If you need to look it up, look it up. Genesis chapter 12, 10 through 13. If you got it, what was it? He went to Egypt, and what did he do? He lied about Sarah. And there he's not trusting in God to protect him. Okay. Fearing that he would be killed. Okay, number 2. Number 2, what part of God's created order did Abram violate in trying to bring an heir into this world through Hagar? Yeah. What's the principle God set up from the very beginning? Marriage is what? One man, one woman. And he violated that one, didn't he? And remember, Jesus actually pointed that out. Even though people might have been in the culture doing that, Jesus, later on when he addresses it, said God set it up from the beginning that there was only one man and only one woman, and that's it. Right? All right, number 3. Number 3. Now this one I'm not sure I fully understand their reasoning in the question, but we can work through it and see. Abram allowed Sarah to do whatever she wanted after Hagar conceived. What consequence might have happened had God not intervened and told Hagar to return? Now, I understand the consequence, but I'm not for sure exactly the reason of the question. Go ahead. It may have been, yeah, that's... So those parts of the prophecy would never have happened, right? Or at least we wouldn't have known anything about it. Not in any significant way. Huh? Maybe it might have been better off. Yeah. That's possible. You never know. Their answer was his son would be lost to him forever, most likely. And okay, I guess it's possible, huh? Yeah, yeah. Number 4, how would you explain how Abram went wrong and not waiting for God's timing? God already told him it's going to happen, but he kind of got it in his mind, like Sarah did, that we got to work this thing out. Give God a little help, like he needs my help. That covenant thing we saw in chapter 15, what was God explicitly saying by the fact that he didn't let Abram be in it? This is me going to fulfill this, not you. You know what they should have done if they really wanted to get this right? Ask God, what do you think we should do? If you really have something, if we've missed something, tell us what we should do. Did they do that? No, they didn't. They just kind of decided to, in their own human wisdom, to bring about their solution to God's taking a long time. And by the way, God's not done yet. He's still got a while. Because remember, he's 86. How old is Abram by the time this thing comes to pass? He's 100 years old. Abram's still got to wait. And Sarah's still got to wait. Another 14 plus years. Yeah, and by that time, Ishmael is 14, 15 years old. Right? Yeah. So, and Ishmael ends up becoming a problem to the child that's the promised child. To the point, as we'll see at a later point, that Sarah had to actually Sarah kicked out Hagar and Ishmael. And Abram was extremely grieved over the fact, and God said, this is what's supposed to be done. And I think that's funny because God said, go back, and now he's saying, let her go. So, it's just a unique thought. So, here's maybe some applications we can think about. God has his purpose and his plan. Our job is to trust him and let him run his own, his way, his time, and not be impatient. That doesn't mean don't do things. God gives us lots of responsibilities to do stuff. In fact, I think a lot of times the reason why things don't happen is because we don't take our responsibility serious, right? But there are some things that God says, let me take care of it. Can I give you one example? When it comes to seeing people saved, that's his work. Does that mean we don't do anything? No. We go give the gospel. Our job is to be faithful to give the gospel. But I can't make anybody believe. I can't convert anybody. If it's me converting them, I converted them, not God. My job is to preach the gospel and let the power of God fall on the hearts of people and change the hearts of people. Right? Because that's exactly what Abraham's being told here in this whole prophecy, this whole promise is, I'm the one that's going to fulfill this covenant, not you. Not you. Let me take care of it in my way, in my time. And you know what becomes very amazing in the whole thing? After the Bible says that Abraham and Sarah were both dead physically, yet God did something that was impossible through them. And she's 90, Abraham's 100, did something that was impossible, brought life from the dead in a kind of very unique way by giving him a child at that late of age. That was the reason for the wait, is so that God got the glory and not Abraham and Sarah. Right? No mistake. Yeah. No mistake. All right, well, let's go ahead and close in prayer, and we'll come back in about 15 minutes. Did you have a question? Okay. Okay. Let's close in prayer. Paul, would you like to close us in prayer?